Let me introduce our speaker, Pete Fleury, talking about the U.S. military helicopters of the last 100 years. Pete's Army career after OCS began on the surface in Vietnam as a field artillery lieutenant. After a new Huey company moved in next door at Phuoc Vihn, he was hooked and came back on his second tour flying the CH-47 Chinook. Pete flew with the active Army and National Guard for the next 20 years. His 26-year corporate career at Rockwell International and Boeing covered much of the globe, modernizing existing military aircraft in the U.S., Europe, South America, and Australia. In his spare time, Pete transitioned into Cessna, Piper, and Mooney planes, no beach feet, and filed IFR frequently. His presentation will cover the development of U.S. military helicopters over the last 100 years, from humble beginnings to the amazing array today. So please give Pete a warm welcome.
I'm trying to figure out how you're going to hear me because the PA system has been a challenge here in the past. We're going to work it out today, I hope. How many people here remember Harry Reasoner from ABC? World famous. And he did a piece in 1971 talking about the helicopter pilots in Vietnam. And he started off this way. He said, the thing is, helicopters are different from planes. An airplane, by its nature, wants to fly. It's not if it's not interrupted too strongly by opposing forces or an incompetent pilot. The helicopter does not want to fly. It's maintained in the air by a variety of controls and forces working in opposition to each other. And if this delicate balance is disturbed in any way, the helicopter stops flying immediately and disastrously. There is no such thing as a gliding helicopter. That's why an airplane pilot is so different from a helicopter pilot. Being an airplane pilot in general are clear-eyed, wide-eyed, buoyant extroverts, while helicopter pilots are brooders, introspective anticipators of trouble. They know if something has not gone wrong yet, it is about to. So with that, Harry launched into his speech, and I won't go any further than that. Okay. Let's go. Let's go. All right. Glad B.
Hit the first arrow.
Yeah, you missed the graphic with the speech, but So helicopters transformed the way that wars are fought. Started out with medevac in Korea, observation, liaison. By the time Vietnam got together, we were launching combat assaults and using helicopters, firing rockets and heavy machine guns. And so it has evolved into an integral part of combat. Early development, these were measures, or these were machines that their success was measured in feet and meters, not necessarily miles, and not in terms of thousands of feet, but in terms of getting off the ground. George Bosatot, his machine was called the Flying Octopus, and it had 4 rotors, and so it just lent that name naturally. There were others that used more innovative kinds of approaches, and I'll show you one.
Is one of man's first attempts to get off the ground in an early type helicopter. How high would he fly? So, let's see. Well, good luck, mister. I gotta go.
So any helicopter pilot would see something wrong with this right away. You know, if it had a tail rotor, it wouldn't have gone 180 degrees around while we were watching it. But that's just the beginning of the problem. There emerged then three different approaches to helicopters as far as the engineering was concerned. And Igor Sikorsky was at the forefront with Sikorsky helicopter. He also built airplanes, which we'll talk about in a minute. Arthur Young was a very inventive guy and perfected what became the single rotor helicopter. And Bell Helicopter hired him, and he patented a way to keep that system stabilized, which we'll talk about in a minute. Then Frank Piasecki took the most complicated approach, which is the tandem rotor helicopter, which, after you get through all the mechanics of it, is the most efficient. Mentioned Sikorsky a minute ago. He also was in the airplane business after he immigrated to the United States. He supplied some of the very first Pan Am Clippers before Boeing got into it with their later model. And but his love was in helicopters. And in fact, in this particular graphic, you can see there's a guy with a hat flying this prototype, and that is Sikorsky. He was his own test pilot. The Sikorsky R4 was actually about the first helicopter used by the United States in combat, and it was used with a commando force in Burma. They brought over a dozen of these machines, and they used them to evacuate wounded people to airstrips where the L4 could then evacuate the patient further to get medical help. And it saved 24 lives. It also wore out all of the helicopters. In that jungle environment and the heat and the humidity, they had wooden rotors. So they literally flew until they wouldn't fly anymore. There was another helicopter that was starting to emerge that time, and that was the R5, which started to see commercial use after the war, and also the R6. But we get into the Bell helicopter, and Arthur Young, as I said, got hired by Bell Helicopter, and he had perfected a system, or device actually, that would enable the rotor to be more stable. Inherently, if you just got a single, what they call semi-rigid rotor blade, teeter-tottering on top of a gimbal, it is very, very oversensitive. And so Young perfected a method of putting a stabilizer bar. You can see it most notably on that or on the Huey in the museum. And what it does with the weights on the end, it forms a gyroscopic plane that stabilizes the rotor system and enables somebody then to move it about without losing control very quickly. That resulted in the Bell 47, which was the first commercial helicopter in production. And Bell built thousands of them. The Army adapted it as the H-13 in Korea, famous opening scene from MASH shows the medevac mission. Meanwhile, Frank Piasecki was perfecting the tandem rotor design. And the early aircraft, they were just naturally bigger aircraft than a single rotor helicopter. And some of them then were perfected to go to the Department of Defense, the Army, and the Marine Corps. And that evolved into the H-21, which actually saw combat in Vietnam. In Korea, then, not only was the observation helicopter in use, the cargo helicopter came into being. You can see the H-19 in the lower left portion of it. And that was the first cargo helicopter in military use. The Marines even figured out how to throw some rockets on it and use it as a gunship. The H-5 I mentioned did see extensive action in Korea, again in the medevac role and also in the observational. This H-19 was that cargo helicopter in Vietnam or in Korea, and it also had a max takeoff weight, a gross weight, such that the net cargo load was 17,000 pounds. The traditional Jeep weighs 24,000 pounds. So the Marines, in their usual method, decided, well, they need a 1,700-pound Jeep. And so what evolved was the M422. We have one at the Air Museum, and it weighs 1,700 pounds. It's primarily aluminum in construction and has a 4-cylinder air-cooled engine. And we were fortunate enough to get one thanks to the efforts of one of our docents who's no longer with us. Mentioned the Bell H-13 before. It had a long and useful life after Korea as a trainer. And for those of us that were in the aviation school as instructors, for example, I was not a flight instructor. I was a platform instructor training warrant officers how to be better officers. And sometimes that's all I would get to fly for my flight pay. But it was a fun machine to fly. Vietnam was the helicopter war. Once the helicopter matured enough to use in a hostile environment like Vietnam, there was a lot of development that occurred, like happens to any aircraft during a war. That H-21 I talked about before was actually powered by the same engine that was in the B-17, the R-1820. And we beefed up a little bit to 1,400 horsepower instead of 1,200 horsepower. And it was a single engine tandem rotor helicopter. It can get a little complicated that way. It actually involved a little different flying techniques than the single rotor helicopter. One of the unsung heroes of that Vietnam conflict was made by an outfit called Command. They built the H-21, and that was a two-rotor helicopter. It was just 90 degrees different than Piaseki's approach. The rotor hubs were side by side. The rotors had a very large diameter, which gave it very good hover characteristics. And the Air Force used it to fight fires on airfields. They had a kit weighed about 860 pounds in order to spray foam. And then the helicopter rotor wash would direct the foam onto the aircraft that was burning. And it was a good measure when you didn't want to get close enough to that aircraft with a hose. It also, this is the unsung hero part, it was used to locally rescue downed airmen and helicopter pilots. And it actually rescued 827 down pilots and passengers, more than any other helicopter during the war. But that's neither here nor there. Command was a very interesting company. In addition to building aircraft, I was at a meeting one time in a conference room with guitars all around the room. And they also made guitars out of synthetic material, and they were very nice guitars. But it was very strange in an aerospace meeting, sitting in a room full of guitars. The H-34 was the evolution of the H-19, and it also used the R-1820 engine, and makes for a very noisy helicopter, by the way. I did get a few rides in that one, and it's not something that you want to be around too long. The Marines used this in Vietnam before they got the Hueys in the early 70s. The Army made a determination when in the early 70s, when they were first in Vietnam, or early 60s, that they would use the H-21 instead of the 34 because they did some studies that suggested that the H-21 was more immune to rifle fire than the 34 was. That's arguable. Sikorsky really emerged into the league once the helicopter business really got going, thanks to the gas turbine engine. I don't know why we call it a gas turbine engine when there's no gas, it's jet fuel, but that's another story. I would have called it the jet turbine. This aircraft, the SH-3 or the HH-3 in the Air Force garb, the Air Force machine was a variation of the original design, which had a boat hull. The Air Force had a standard hull and a ramp in the back to load cargo and people, but it was also amphibious, just like the SH-3 was. The aircraft kept growing as a result of better and better and bigger engine technology, and that produced what everybody called the flying crane. Forget what the Army called it, but it was called the flying crane. And I think that's still flying in some firefighting efforts, but it was a 20,000-pound capable machine in Vietnam. Chinooks would only lift 10,000 pounds, so we were medium helicopters. And you can see it picking up a prepped Chinook here, so that gives you some idea. However, the Chinook grew because of engine technology to where it had that same lift capacity, and at that point, the Army just retired the 54, didn't need that anymore. But that design of the 54 was also used in the H-53, which then again was a standard kind of cargo helicopter. And this machine was used by the Air Force. It was the original Jolly Green Giant, rescuing downed airmen principally in North Vietnam. And we have someone that can speak to that more directly, Frank, but that was the type of helicopter that pulled you out. As the jet age advanced, so did Vertol, which Piasecki became Vertol helicopters, which eventually became Boeing Vertol helicopters. And the H-46 was originally marketed to the Army, and the Army said, well, it's not big enough. So they marketed it to the Marines, and the Marines liked it. They bought it. The Navy also used it as a utility and general purpose helicopter. And so it had a long life. I can remember when I worked for Boeing, going into Philadelphia once in a while to that facility, and they had a logistics section there supporting all the 46s that were left in the Marine Corps. And they called them frogs. I don't know why they call them frogs, but they were called them frogs. And they had a big banner across the engineering bay saying "Frogs Forever." Of course, it wasn't forever. It got replaced by the MV-22. This was one of the real heroes in Vietnam. The OH-6 was made by Hughes Helicopter, which became McDonnell Douglas Helicopters, which became Boeing helicopters. And it is actually still in production in limited quantities for special operations. It's an advanced version of this airframe. But what was remarkable about it was the airframe, because the egg shape lent itself to survivability. In a crash sequence, the rotors and the tail boom and the skids would just all kind of break away in the sequence. And when it all stopped rolling, the pilot would open the door, get out, and walk away. It was used extensively in a tactic with the Cobra, where they would hover low in a hostile region looking for trouble. And as soon as they got shot at, the Cobras would roll in and begin to pay them back. That was not a job I would want to have. We did have one of our docents that was a pilot flying this mission, and he was shot down 3 times, and on the 3rd time he got hurt so bad that he couldn't fly again. Bell helicopter advanced from that H-13 that you saw into the Huey. Originally, the A model and the B model were designed for medevac. You could put 2 leaders stacked against the firewall and the medic facing rearward from the cockpit area, and it would serve a much better platform than the H-13 did. You were inside for one thing. As that evolved, though, they saw a need for a bigger helicopter. So the D model is actually 4 feet longer than the B or the C. And the D model then has another bench in it, 4 more feet of fuselage, so that you have 8 combat troops in there instead of 4. So then they took what was the originally a medevac version and started hanging armament on the Bs and the C models. And you can see that there was a variety of different armaments, rockets, the flex machine guns. They even tried 50s, but 50s was a little tough on the airframe. So they stayed with the 7.62 until they got a minigun version of the M60 or the 7.62, and that was a suitable weapon on this as well. You see one that says Navy on it, and I was with a Chinook or a Huey company that was at Fort Benning, and we were training Navy pilots, getting them qualified in this aircraft and familiarized with the weapon systems. And we had 21 days to do that. They were on 21-day letter orders en route to Vietnam. These were helicopter pilots, obviously. And so if it rained during the week and we couldn't get the range, then we worked on weekends. But the aircraft themselves were actually Army. They just got some paint, erased Army, and put Navy on the side, and they were consigned to the Navy. And they used this aircraft in the Delta region of Vietnam to protect their river marine patrol boats. And they did a hell of a job. They were called the Sea Wolves. You'll also see there is a D model shown here. One slide off. The D model, as I said, was 4 feet longer, and it was used usually in a formation of 21 to 24 helicopters in succeeding Vs of 3. And they would land into an area previously unoccupied, at least by us, in Vietnam, and it would be prepped with artillery, and it would be prepped with airstrikes, and then escorts would be provided by these armed A or armed B and C model helicopters. But the Bs and the Cs couldn't keep up with what was called the slicks, which had the troops on board, because of all the armament that was hanging on the outside, aerodynamically slowed them down. So that led to the Cobra, which I'll talk about. I mentioned the medevac mission. That evolved into the D model because they could put more patients into it. And we have a D model at the Air Museum that is really a work of art. It looks like somebody got hold of it with a can of spray paint, but it was actually a work done by Steve Maloney, rest in peace. And he used that aircraft as a mural, if you like, to portray and commemorate the fighting men in Vietnam. So the other missions that the Huey did, it was pretty good in logistics. You could lift, I think what you got, about 1,200 pounds. And so it did serve in a minor role there. I talked about the Cobra is actually, it was marketed by Bell as being 40% common with the Huey in terms of the drivetrain, the engine, flight control. And I didn't get qualified in the Huey or in the Cobra, but I did get some front seat time in it flying. And it was a real sports car compared to the Huey because it was this wide and you were strictly flying with bullets and fuel and occasionally rockets. So the AH-1 again was not only used in the combat support role as for a combat assault, but also in these 100-kilo missions that I talked about with the LOHs. And they did a lot of work in Vietnam. I must point out in Vietnam that the Huey was certainly a pretty dangerous job, probably more so than the Cobra was. Because the Cobras, when they would run out of ammo, they would continue to make passes, and you know the guys on the ground didn't know if they had anything left or not. They would just keep their heads down, and that served the mission: keep their heads down. But going back to the Huey, it really took a beating in Vietnam. There were 7,000 sent to Vietnam. 3,200 did not come back, and many of those were not combat losses, but accidents. And you had 19-year-old kids flying these things around fresh out of warrant officer flight training. And everybody, and I mean everybody, flew those aircraft, no matter what it was, whatever you were flying into the max of its design limits all the time. And that invites trouble. I talked about the 100-killer team. The LOH, the OH-6 also had some armament on it, a little minigun on one side. But again, I wouldn't really want to walk into the middle of a Vietnam or a Viet Cong hutch. And I'm sitting there with a minigun in the air and I'm a dead target. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Chinook. I flew a tour in Vietnam, about 800 combat hours. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how at least a Chinook pilot lived in Vietnam, and I'll point out that that was a little bit better. It was the real aircraft that added mobility. The CH-54, anything that you could lift on it had to be lifted outside, and there weren't very many of them. There were many Chinooks, on the other hand. This scene, by the way, I would not have wanted to be a part of. If you look closely, there's another Chinook amid that cloud of dust in the background. And that was one of the worst things about where I was. 7 months out of the year, it was just as dusty as this place. And you would kick up dust everywhere. And so every time you came in to pick up a load, you were literally IFR on the ground. The only thing I could see was down below the bubble. I could see a patch of ground and have a crew chief talking to me to get over the load. We moved artillery. That was one of the, I wouldn't say a primary mission, but the primary mission was every day, what we called ash and trash, water trailers, ammunition, personnel replacements. All the troops in the field relied on us every day for bare existence, because you couldn't drink that water that was everywhere in the rivers. Oh, there's one more story there too. I was moving a field artillery battery one time from point A to point B, and the way we would pick that up, you can see it here. You would pick up the gun first, and then next to it, you could see a bag that was full of 105 ammo. And so it was a piggyback load. So you pick up the gun, then you'd reposition, get over the ammo bag, continue up until you had both loads underneath the aircraft, and then you were cleared for hover once you got the load up to 20 feet. And that flight engineer looking down through the hole above the cargo hook was your eyes for this kind of mission. We did this all the time. So I was flying from point A to point B with a howitzer and the bag underneath it when the straps between the howitzer and the aircraft broke. And that's not our fault because that was the using unit's responsibility on the ground. So I did a hard left turn and watched the bag and the gun do a cartwheel all the way into the middle of a rice paddy. And pretty soon, the villagers nearby, they start streaming out like ants to check this out, which we didn't want because those ammo rounds were also used for mines, explosives in the road. And so to follow the rules, we would have had to call division headquarters, who in turn calls the advisor for the villagers around there to get permission from the village chief to put down suppressive fire. That's when you have a radio failure. So we kept them away from that stuff until they could get some Hueys on the ground and recover the ammo. The gun we didn't care about at that point. It wasn't going to be used anymore. But the general cargo mission, well, we would pick up a variety of stuff in a bag. It was called an A-22 bag. And we saw that one quite often, or a water trailer, as a daily mission that we would haul from point A to point B all day. The water trailer weighed 4,000 pounds. We could pick up 2 of them if you wanted to make a piggyback load out of it. And then we would haul the empty one back. Vehicles, we didn't want to put them inside. We could, but the preference was to keep everything outside because it was fast. You didn't want to be on the ground for any length of time in the landing zone. I remember being on an airstrip one time, evacuating Vietnamese villagers from a village that was under siege by the Viet Cong. We put 78 people into that aircraft and pulled them out, and I'm watching mortar rounds land one side then the other, and as an old artillery guy, I know what's next. So those were exciting times. Here, the Chinook, as I said, evolved into the ability to haul itself, literally. You have to strip the rotors off, you have to take the engines out to get it light enough, but it can pull out another Chinook. I did pull out some Hueys that were in various places. There's an eye right on top of the Huey rotor when you wrap a strap into that eye, and then you can hook it up to the cargo hook of a Chinook and fly the whole thing away. We couldn't get more than about 40 knots flying it that way because the Huey would start swinging underneath if you got much faster than that. Again, we didn't like hauling troops because we spent too much time on the ground getting 30 plus people out of the aircraft. However, we did do that a couple of times with Vietnamese Army troops, and we put in, on several occasions, five Chinooks would put in 250 soldiers, Vietnamese soldiers, because we could put 50 of them on board since they were smaller. And that's the most dangerous mission I flew over there that I can recall, except for another incident where I won't get into it. General dimensions, I can put it this way. When I was flying with the National Guard out of Iowa, going up to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, they didn't make any provisions for us up there. So we would put a pickup truck into the aircraft, no problem at all. And if we wanted 2 vehicles, we could put a Harvester Scout, which was the original SUV. We could put them bumper to bumper inside. It is amphibious. I did a mission one time in Fort Benning. We filmed a Ranger squad deploying from a Chinook in a raft over water. And it didn't work out quite according to plan. We did a fit check of the raft going on the tarmac, be sure that it would fit and get out, no problem. But no one thought about, well, we can't lower the ramp when it's in the water. So we got to the water part of it, and the tongue is retracted, which gives you a fairly good opening. But the transmission, the aft transmission, was getting in the way of this inflated raft getting deployed. So that didn't work very well. The special operations came up with a technique where it will taxi, of course, on the water, and they would taxi at about 10 knots. And so we get enough water flow that it wouldn't come back into the aircraft when you lowered the ramp. And then they would take a well-powered raft and just drive it right up the ramp and into the aircraft as the aircraft's moving along at 10 knots over the water. Really fun thing to watch. You see me on the deck there. That I landed on the deck. There was a converted hospital ship in Longtown Harbor, and that was an aviation parts depot for the Army. So we were constantly going down there to get engines, because an engine in that environment would only last about 250 hours before overhaul. The dust just killed them. And so I landed there a couple of times to get engines, and my hat's off to the Navy and the Coast Guard, because landing on a moving deck is no fun. So our day was very different from the, say, the Huey pilots and the medevac pilots waiting for something to happen. We had a schedule the night before. We had a mission sheet, a little bit like an airline, where I had maybe 12 different units to support that day, and sometimes it'd be 2 missions, sometimes it'd be 3 missions, where we were routing supplies out to the field and taking whatever back needed to be taken back. And sometimes if, for example, a unit the night before put in a request for 2 turnaround sorties, and they really needed 3. So they would ask us for another turn. And usually the conversation was, well, do you have any captured AK-47s? And usually the answer was yes. So we would do another mission for a captured AK-47. And then we would collect those 47s and we would trade them to a Navy depot in Saigon for steaks. So every Wednesday and every Sunday was steak night. And we had a barbecue pit and cook your own steaks. It was almost Air Force standard. The country looked like this in the dry season. The rice paddies were pretty well dried out. And then when you got to the wet season, I mean, it didn't rain constantly. It would roll in for 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon and rain cats and dogs. And then it would settle out. So you found yourself nearly IFR once in a while. You didn't want to go IFR because there wasn't a network like we have. You were landing to an ADF beacon if you were in trouble, and nobody wanted to do that. I compare landing or living conditions for a minute. This was in my first tour in the Field Artillery Battalion, and the tent behind me was my office also, along with my CO. So we worked there, we slept there, and those were better living conditions than the infantry by far. Not much in the way of entertainment, sitting around smoking and maybe drinking a beer after work. Compare that to where I was flying a Chinook. That is where I live, that middle piece there, right? The one with the sandbags in the front. And we had a concrete floor, we had nice wooden sides with screens and galvanized metal roofs, and it was a much better existence than a tent. You'll see us getting suntans even. You can see the new guy on the left side because I don't have a suntan yet. And why do we do that? We built a swimming pool. We got a big runway bladder, rubber runway bladder, dug a hole, shored it up with sandbags, then covered the sandbags with aluminum planking and fenced it in. We got a pump. We needed a pump. Again, that Navy supply depot, the guys that got the stakes, we also got a pump. I was part of the 242nd Assault Support Helicopter Company called the Mule Skinners. And I'm standing in front of one of 16 aircraft that we had. And the instrument panel, as you can see, was pretty standard for the time with a whole array of steam gauges and caution lights. And you can see it parked in the revetment. And it was a nice thing in terms of being able to fly something like that with 2 engines. And I had 3 engine failures in Vietnam, and every time I flew home. This is Cu Chi, and what happened in Cu Chi was we got there last. So there was no room next to the airstrip, which you can see towards the center. Instead, we were on the southeast corner, and that invites trouble. 3 weeks after I left, there was an attack done by very skilled North Vietnamese sappers that penetrated the wire and threw satchel charges into 9 of our Chinooks, destroyed 9 aircraft in one raid. Most of them died in the process. They came in almost naked so that they wouldn't trip any of the tripwires in the concertina barriers around the camp. And they didn't even have armament. They just came in with the satchel charges, and supposedly they were going to get out, but most of them didn't. We only lost 1 person in this raid. We knew, as it turns out, that this might happen. The crew chiefs were sleeping on the aircraft at the time. You can see the revetments here, and they worked pretty well against mortar fire as long as it came in on the side, not from the front or the back. That was the result of the sapper raid. The irony of that is the Hangar Queen 017 did not get touched at all. It's like they knew that was the Hangar Queen. So overall, there were 22 Chinook units in Vietnam. There were 132 aircraft lost, and most of those were accidents or failures, not hostile fire. We lost 1 aircraft. You can see 019, what's left of it there. It landed into a support area, and they had arranged a rubber bladder to have a nice flat dust-free surface to land on. And they were still shoring up the edges of it. They hadn't quite finished with that. So the aircraft came in, landed, and 1 corner of that bladder came up into the rotor wash, which desynchronized the blades immediately. There were 8 people on board. They all managed to get out. But the aircraft just went up in flames, and that was all that was left. "60 years later, the Chinook is still in production. The current F model will pick up almost 3 times as much weight as we could pick up with the A model. And that's just the result of engine technology. Many of these aircraft are rebuilds of earlier models because the basic airframe is damn good. The cockpit you see there is a real contrast to the one you saw earlier. It almost looks like an airliner. It's got 5 panel mount displays, coupled GPS navigation, hands-off hover, all the things we wished that never had. There were some other aircraft, of course, in the post-Vietnam era. The Bell OH-58 came into being because Hughes and the Army couldn't agree after 1,438 airframes on subsequent contracts. So Army recompeted the contract. And Bell by this time had taken their ugly prototype that they lost to Hughes in initially and put a shark nose on it, put some more space in it, started marketing it commercially. And so that was the entrant in the recompetition. And that emerged into the OH-58. And I've had a lot of hours, I wouldn't say a lot of hours, several hundred hours in the OH-58 when, again, I couldn't fly anything else as a staff guy. And it was nothing like the OH-6. I didn't fly the OH-6, but I did fly a civilian counterpart a few times, the MD-500, and it was just a natural airframe. I mean, you got into it and started flying it, it was like you flew in it for 500 hours. This machine was not that way. And it was underpowered because the Army specified it had to use the same power plant and the basic weight was 600 pounds more. The Black Hawk replaced the Huey. Started coming in the 70s. And the Huey could endure maybe a 450-foot rate of descent in a hard landing. This aircraft could endure a 1,500-foot rate of descent on a hard landing because of the tail wheel coming onto a very beefy set of mains. And I saw some film one time of that feature in test. And I don't think I want to fly that aircraft after that, but you could walk away from it. So it became the standard for many different countries. I don't say how many there are, I forget how many. Is it there? Yeah, 24 other countries there, 28 countries altogether. By the way, that is still in production. The Hughes Apache was one of the more controversial aircraft that came into being for the Army. It originally flew in the 70s, 75 to be exact, and it took a lot of fighting by the Army to get the funding to actually field the aircraft. It took over 10 years. And a general by the name of Brown, General Harold Brown, who was a spearhead, and he, as much as anybody, was responsible for getting this aircraft into production. So over 5,000 of those have been made, and they've evolved from the A model into an E model. The E model has a glass cockpit, all the modern day weapons. I'm not sure if it still has this controversial monocular display that was the night vision device for the earlier pilots. So you had a monocular here looking at FLIR imagery and flight imagery like a HUD. And then you got naked eyeball looking the other way, and you could train yourself just to look at one or the other at any given time. The Bell Osprey, I should say Bell Boeing, I'll explain that in a minute. That was the successor to the Frog, the H-46. And again, it had a long and painful development cycle from the time it flew to the time we got it into production. A couple of aircraft were lost along the way in flight tests, including 15 or so Marines that were on board on one of them. And it took a long time to work all the bugs out of this design. I did get a chance one time when I was in a plant in Philadelphia to fly a simulator, fairly high fidelity, and it doesn't fly without computers. So the transition from hover to forward flight is very much a flight control computer problem, not the pilot problem. You can't fly this aircraft without that computer. I never thought I would see the Army buy something from a European company, but this is exactly what happened with the UH-72. It's not really a combat helicopter. It has all the markings of the Eurocopter that it comes from. The only difference is that they painted it olive drab and they put a military radio in it. It's not hardened for combat in any way. So it's mainly a trainer or an administrative machine. The Army's using it as a primary trainer. They're having a lot of problems with that because it's a little complex for somebody that's never flown anything before. Just going into 2 engines the right way. The Navy tried that. They decided to stick with a version of the OH-58 that they use as a primary trainer. So its future is mainly administrative in the United States, administrative and training. The Black Hawk is going away eventually, and Bell won a competition 10 years ago with what they call the MV-280. 280 being, the 280 number comes from the fact that it will do 280 miles per hour. So I'm just saying that's what I read. It's going to take some time. You won't see it until the start of the next decade. But again, it's the V-22 in a new kind of drag. Any questions? I'm sorry, say it again.
You guys got stakes, got AKs. Where the AKs all want to go? AK-47.
Oh, the AK-47s. Well, I really don't know what those guys in that Navy depot did with those AK-47s. I'm guessing some of them, of course, were kept as souvenirs for a while, couldn't take them home. And they probably traded them for something else. The whole combat zone, and this is not anything new, money was useless. It was a barter economy that you traded things for things.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah. Let me go back to that AH-64. Uh-oh. We lost it. Yeah, you saw in that AH-64 slide one that was like this. I didn't flip the picture. That was done by a Dutch AH-64 that was used as a flight show air show demonstrator, much like the Air Force has flight demonstration teams of an A-10 or an F-16. The Dutch in this case were using an AH-64, and he was flying loops with an AH-64. If you have enough forward air speed, you can convert that to enough energy to do a loop. Backwards, I remember in the Chinook, I don't think there was a limitation on backward flight, although you could certainly fly it backwards. You didn't want to, since you can't see where you're going. You could also fly sideways up to a limit of 30 knots. So it'll go any way you want it to go, but you don't want to go backwards. And that was the first thing that anybody did when they got the flight controls. You got the flight controls first time. It went backwards.
All right.
All right, thank you.
Well, Pete, thank you very much for an issue presentation.